Okay, guys, so I believe we are good to go. Let me double check here. Nope, looks like it should be good. So study session should be going. I can see that I've got 3 people who are waiting on me right now, and I have a question that's already come in via Twitter, so that's good. So let me know, guys, if like the lighting's funky, because if I turn on the overhead light in here, it looks kind of weird. So I've just gone sitting by the window, and it's open as well. So if it's super loud and you guys can't hear me, let me know as well, and I can change things up there. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So um, I plan on doing this study session from 3 to 5. If we finish before then, that's okay, so long as you guys get the questions that you need answered done. But right now, I only have one question on the block. It's from Allison. Everybody else, if there are 4 people watching right now, pull up the studies guide that I sent out earlier, look it over, see if there are any terms that you don't understand, or anything like that. Any questions you have, and go ahead and type them in the live chat. But I'm going to go ahead and answer Allison's question right off the bat here. So Allison wants to know, can I explain how decision-making flows between the supreme leader and the president? So the supreme leader in Iran is truly the supreme leader. He is in charge of essentially everything. His powers given to him by the Constitution are enormous. He has the ability to control the military. He has the right to overrule any presidential decision. He can remove the president from office. He can't appoint the president. President must be appointed through a direct election. However, he can remove him, and it's always a male. In terms of decision making for the president is that the president is not fully autonomous. He has his power checked, not through the legislative branch in the same sort of way as other presidents do, although he can have his powers checked through the legislative branch or through the judicial branch, but also through the supreme leader, who is kind of a branch in and of himself. Like, he is his own tree, like I said in class. So the supreme leader has the ability to allow the president to do what he wants to do in terms of policy, foreign negotiations with other countries and everything. However, that is all done at the supreme leader's discretion. And if the supreme leader doesn't like what the president is doing, he can very easily overrule him. So essentially, like Ahmadinejad was as president up until 2013, was really controversial and very, very sort of confrontational on an international level. And he was allowed to do that because his policies that he was pushing forward, were in line with the supreme leader's beliefs and decisions. If he had crossed a line that the supreme leader didn't like, he would have been removed from office, but he wasn't. So we can assume that when a president does something in Iran, he is doing something with the either approval or tacit approval of the supreme leader. Now, Rouhani is a slightly different case. Rouhani is a conservative pragmatic, meaning that he's much more in favor of economic liberalization. And in that way, he is very much sort of in opposition to the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So he is in a bit of a position here. And that means that he is somewhat constrained in what he can say and do, especially on a domestic level. However, the widespread protests in 2009 and the economic downturn that Iran has really been going through as a result of sanctions, Rouhani has been given a surprising amount of leeway to negotiate on an international level, which is why the Iranian nuclear deal got passed through the Majlis, and why it was signed into effect. So we will see how that turns out after this upcoming election. So, like, watch your clocks. Let's see here. Kat has a couple of questions, which is really good. Excellent. Okay. All right. Kat wants to know, can I explain what the National Front was and is, and the significance of Mohammad Mossadegh, including his particular political views? Okay. That's a good place to start. So, pardon me. All right. The National Front was an opposition group, essentially a political party, although that was technically illegal at the time. It's an opposition group that was formed against Shah Muhammad, or rather Muhammad Reza Shah, the last of the Pahlavi dynasty. And basically, what had occurred was Mohammad Reza Shah, starting in the 1950s, etc., had really kind of allowed a lot of foreign industries in to accelerate the extraction of oil in Iran. Iran was becoming more of a rentier state, and Mohammad Reza Shah really did not like that. He did not like the fact that there was this foreign reliance on oil for this foreign reliance on like Shell and BP extracting oil, and he thought it gave, frankly, international actors like foreign states and foreign corporations too much power over Iran, which it probably did. So yeah, that's right. Mohammad Mossadegh starts organizing, and he organizes into this group called the National Front. Now, the National Front, Mossadegh had definitely some socialist leanings, and the National Front did gain support from the Tudeh, and the Tudeh was a communist organization within Iran under the last Shah. Now, ultimately, in the next parliamentary elections, Mossadegh's party, the National Front, gained a lot of seats, and thus he became prime minister of Iran. And that was deeply concerning to much of the West, because, especially the United States and Great Britain, because part of the reason why they put up with the Shah, who they absolutely knew was totalitarian, had dictator-like tendencies. Part of the reason why they put up with him was because he was so vehemently anti-communist, and that was useful to him, to the United States and Great Britain. But Mossadegh in power had socialist leanings, and that made the United States and the UK extremely concerned. If you think about its location within the Middle East, Iran is uniquely positioned. It's right across the Caspian from the USSR. It's right next door to Afghanistan, which eventually would be a place of a Cold War struggle in the 1970s. So, like, there were reasons why the US and the UK were deeply concerned about Mossadegh's rise to power. And then when he becomes prime minister, he attempts to nationalize the oil industry in Iran, sort of on the model of what happened in Mexico and, in Mexico. And so that was deeply concerning. People took that as an indication that he was going to side with the USSR in the Cold War. So the US and Great Britain organized something called Operation Ajax, and they collaborated to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh and his government. This allowed the Shah to return back to the country, and it also made deeply, deeply suspicious of any sort of popular vote, any sort of elections. He became very concerned about political parties and what they were doing and how they might be acting against him. So he becomes more and more authoritarian as a result of that. The overthrow of Mossadegh is really, really deeply important in terms of Iranian political history overall, because what it shows is the extent to which the United States and the British government were willing to intervene in Iranian sovereignty. And that concern and fear has not gone away in Iran. That is something that people are still very concerned about. And it's one of the reasons why the US is frequently referred to as the great Satan of the world, et cetera, in Iran, because of this historical role the US and the UK played in the overthrow of a democratically elected leader. That's hard to forgive in a lot of ways. Let's see here. I've got a question that has come in via Twitter from Audrey and from Jessica, who are taking pictures of themselves at Panera. I feel like I need to show this to you guys so you can appreciate it. These are, I guess it's proof that there is studying going on. There we go. Okay, so they want to know what the role of the Expediency Council and the Guardians Council is on the legislation. Okay, legislature. All right. That doesn't work very well. You can only see reflections. Okay. All right. So the okay. So we'll think of it this way. In most government structures, the way it works is that the legislative body writes the laws and then it gets passed up to the executive branch for approval or to be overturned, right? That's how that goes. But in Iran, it's not so simple. What happens with legislation is the legislative body, the parliament, which is called the Mejlis, writes legislation, and then they have to pass it through a number of bodies before it can go to the president to be signed into law. The president still has to sign it into law regardless, but the way it goes here is there's like 2 extra steps before it even gets to the president's desk, and at any one of those points it can be got rid of. So the first thing it does is it goes to the Expediency Council, which is made up of about 32 members, and this includes the president, this includes 6 members of the Guardian Council, and it includes the head of the judiciary. Now, the Expediency Council largely functions as an advisory board to the supreme leader, but it also looks at any piece of legislation coming out of the legislative body and attempts to rectify any problems that it might find that would make it possible for the Guardian Council to overturn it. Now, that's easier to do in the Expediency Council because you already have 6 members of the Guardian Council there looking at the legislation. So what will happen is the Expediency Council will look at any type of law, canon, whatever, and basically determine whether or not it's going to be problematic with regards to Islamic beliefs and Sharia. And then if they find problems, they try to come up with solutions to those problems in the Expediency Council. Then they send it back down to the Mejlis and have them resolve it before it gets vetoed by the Guardian Council. Then, let's say that there's nothing wrong with the legislation. Everything's in accordance with sort of interpretation of Sharia, etc., etc. Then it would get passed on to the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council would look at it. Now, the Guardian Council is composed of 12 men, 6 clerics, 6 jurists. They are all going to be Shiite, and they're all going to be probably be very, very conservative. 6 of these are appointed directly by the supreme leader. 6 are appointed by the head jurist. However, the head jurist is appointed by the supreme leader, so the likelihood is that the jurists are going to be people who hold the same views as the supreme leader. So these 12 men will then look at the legislation that is passed through the legislative body into the Expediency Council, and then analyze it and see if they agree with it, if there's any problems. Now, if they agree with it, it passes on to the president. President signs it into law. Poof, we're done. Unless the supreme leader still has a problem with it, and then he can overturn it. But the Guardian Council frequently, if it does find problems that were not addressed in the Expediency Council, they will send it back to the legislative body to be reworked. Or they will simply veto it and not allow it to be reworked at all if they say that there's nothing redeemable about it. Okay? So that's broadly how it works with regards to legislation. Now, I have another question from Kat here. Kat wants to know what's significant about Prime Minister Bazargan. Okay, so Prime Minister Bazargan was the Prime Minister of the, oh gosh, what is the phrase I'm looking for? He was prime minister for the provisional government after the removal of the Shah in 1979. In 1979, the Shah leaves, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini comes back, and he is declared to be supreme leader, but there's no constitution yet. Now, the supreme Ayatollah Khomeini had written a constitution, a draft constitution, but it hadn't been ratified at that point. So there was a prime minister, kind of from the leftover bits of the legislative body that was allowed under the Shah. And this prime minister was Bazargan. Now, Bazargan was a moderate, and it seems very likely that he would have probably fought a lot of the elements within the proposed draft constitution issued by Khomeini. However, he was in direct opposition to the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's position with regards to the American hostage crisis. Bazargan wanted to, he did not like the fact that Khomeini was going to allow the hostage crisis to continue, because Ayatollah Khomeini could have overturned the students' decisions at any moment, and he chose not to. And Bazargan was a little bit more of a conventional politician, very much of the opinion that knowledge was a thing that you should abide by, and part of diplomatic privilege was that you didn't mistreat each other's diplomats, and keeping people as hostages is a direct violation of all of those basic laws. So as a result of Khomeini's position with regards to the hostage crisis, he resigned his position as prime minister of Iran. Now, there are a lot of people who look at this and say that part of the reason why Khomeini chose not to condemn the taking of American hostages in 1979 all the way through 1981, January 20th, 1981, is because of the fact that he was trying to get Bazargan out of politics. He didn't want him involved because he might have been a moderating factor on the theocracy that the Ayatollah wanted to incur here. So hopefully that helps there. Let's see if I have anything else coming in via Twitter. Nope. All right. Kira. Kira has a question. Gabby and Kira. Hi, Gabby and Kira. They want to know, to what extent do we need to know about the persecution of the Baha'i? It is a good example of, first of all, one of the major social cleavages in Iran, which is religion. You also need to know, perhaps, think about it in comparison to social cleavages based on religion in other states that we have talked about. Frequently, the AP exam will ask you things like, which of the following is not a correct association of a religious minority with the correct nation state? And then you have to like match it up. So it would be things like, you'd have to know Tibetan Buddhism in China, you'd have to know Baha'i in Iran, you might have to know Muslims in Russia, and be able to match them up, right? So to that extent, it's also a good sort of case study look at sort of the role of, to what extent Iran really is a theocracy, right? That people who are not part of this religious inclusive group are kept out of the government structure. That's a good example there. Okay. All right. Kat wants to know, how is the 1979 Iranian Revolution similar to other revolutions in your case study countries? Okay. Well, I would definitely draw a direct parallel between the 79 revolution in Iran and the 49 revolution in China. If for no other reason than you can look at it as sort of this idea of purification. And also, frankly, the 1917 revolution, to a degree, no, not Mexico's different. 1917 revolution in the USSR, or rather it was still Russia at the time. You could make the argument that what they're doing here is they're trying to purify government and create this government based on a set of ideals, religious or political, whatever they are. I mean, if you think about it, when we talked about communism, we frequently spoke of it as a civic religion. And in that sort of way, sort of the devotion to doctrine, the emphasis on correct thought, there are real parallels to make between sort of the communist revolutions in China and in Russia and the revolution in Iran. The big difference there is, of course, that two of those are atheist and one of those is deeply, deeply religious. But they're tied to these ideas of sort of like correct thought. And both of those groups, well, especially China, they have sort of a continuing emphasis on the revolution. And in Mexico, too, the idea of continuing the revolution after its conclusion. In China and in Iran, you can see that in the cultural revolutions that they have, where anybody who is not adhering to correct thought, correct dogma, can be arrested. I mean, in a religious sense, in Iran, we're talking about people who are violating Sharia or not dressing appropriately, not expressing the correct level of piety, etc. In China, we're mostly seeing that with regards to holding on to old culture, old ideas, etc. But in Mexico, you also have this idea of institutionalizing the revolution, keeping it going, even after the revolution is done. I mean, that's what the Partido Revolucionario Institucional is, right? It's an institutionalized revolution, sort of like Maoist thought about keeping the revolution going and keeping support for the ideals of the revolution going. So let's see here. And I'm out of questions now, guys. Surely that's not it. Now, there are only 4 of you watching. And I know Allison has come up with a question and Audrey has come up with a question, and they may not be watching right now, but if I don't get any more questions, I'm not going to answer anything else, and I'm just going to stop. And then you'll only have 19 minutes worth of a study session instead of 2 hours. That'll be unfortunate. Come on, guys. Iran's hard. You should have some questions here. Waiting. Do, 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 do. Come on, guys. There we go. We've got some questions on Twitter. Excellent. You should all thank Andrew and Leanne for saving you here. Okay, and thank you, Kat. I see yours as well. I'll get to you in a moment. So Andrew has a question. Can I explain the importance of ministries in Iran? Okay, so the bureaucracy system in Iran is really big. Ministries are just what the Iranian government calls their bureaucracies. So instead of talking about like the Department of Education or the Department of Defense, they talk about ministries. In that sort of way, it's very similar to like Britain, because Britain does the same thing. So Iran has really large bureaucracies. Part of that has to do sort of with like patron-client relationships here, and they tend to be kind of overburdened with a whole lot of red tape. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're dealing with sort of cultural censorship issues and approval of that everything is in correct. Everything shows the correct religious sensibilities. So the various ministries are largely headed by clerics. Most of the people in charge of government ministries are clerics. That's another way that you can see kind of the influence of religion on politics in Iran. And some of them are pretty straightforward ministries. There's, a Ministry of Internal Revenue. There's a Ministry of Defense and things like that. But then there's also ministries of culture and Islamic guidance, which is very, very different from anything that we have here. So ministries of culture and Islamic guidance, hang on. I think my Wi-Fi might be doing some weird stuff right now for you guys. Hopefully it's working. If not, someone send me a message in the live chat and I'll try to figure it out. Let's see here. Maybe. Okay. All right. But regardless, the ministries, yeah, they tend to be pretty powerful entities. So you've got like the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, which oversees stuff like media, anything that's published or anything that is shown in movie theaters, anything that's on television has to go through there. And it issues publication licenses and it can withdraw them as well. So the ministries are very, very powerful and they are technically under the authority of the president. The president does have the right to appoint people to those ministries, although they have to be confirmed through the legislative body. Now, remember, his decisions can ultimately be overturned by the supreme leader. So if he should appoint someone to a ministry who the supreme leader really doesn't like for that job, then that person will not hold that position and the supreme leader will guide the president towards the right decision. So there's that. Then we've got, let's see here. Kat, I'll go ahead and answer yours. Can I go over the Iranian constitutional revolution as well? Sure thing. So after the collapse of the Safavid Empire in 1722, something like that. It's early 18th century, regardless. So the Safavid Empire is really the first time that we see Shiism as the dominant form of Islam in Iran. Prior to that, under the Abbasid Caliphate, there's some Shiism, but it's not dominant. And then there's the Ilkhanate ruled by the Mongols, which is predominantly Sunni. But it's really not until the Safavid Empire when you have these Azeri tribesmen come down from Azerbaijan, and you have Ismail I declare himself to be essentially of the line of the slain Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and basically claim religious justification for rule as well. So the Safavid Empire ends in 1722-ish. And it falls to a bunch of nomadic invaders. There's tribal stuff that goes on for a while, until the Qajars come to power. Now, the Qajars are a Turkic group. They are Shiites, but they do not claim to be descended from the Prophet. They do not claim to be of the line of imams. So what they do is essentially they have clerics that kind of lead, that are in charge of religious guidance. They do not claim to like rule through religious like doctrine. So what we see with them is sort of the establishment of the idea of a guardian council. So the Qajars kind of set up that idea, and they kind of limp through the 19th century, becoming less and less relevant. And a early 20th century, we're talking like 1905, there is a real threat to their power through popular uprisings. So in order to try and legitimate their power, the Qajars basically decide to undergo a constitutional process. They are going to have the writing of the first constitution for Persia, because it's still known as Persia at that point. They're going to have a constitution written. And between 1905 and 1909, there are a number of major reforms undertaken in Persia. These reforms include universal male suffrage, so all men can vote. The constitution established for the first time a legislative body in Persia, later Iran. That legislative body is the Majlis. They do also write into law the idea of a guardian council, something that makes sure that everything is in accordance with religious tradition. So the idea of a guardian council is not just like coming out of thin air and like landing in Ayatollah Khomeini's head. This is something that has religious as well as secular tradition in Persia. And so when he writes it into the constitution formed in 1979, like there is historical background for that. It's not just out of nowhere. So the Constitution of 1906, that's the one as a result of the Constitutional Revolution, it essentially establishes a constitutional monarchy in Persia. It does allow for some limited democratic representation, but it also establishes the beginnings of sort of religious oversight in the government structure. Now, the Qajars are doing this primarily to try and prop up a declining dynasty, and ultimately they're not very powerful, nor are they very popular. And so when they're overthrown in 1921 by a young military officer by the name of Reza Pahlavi, there's not a whole lot to prevent them from going the way of the dinosaurs, and that's what begins the rule of the Shahs in Iran. Now let's see here. Leanne had a couple of questions. Okay, can I explain Kanun? Can I explain the the Baji resistance fork and Faki? I can do all three. Okay, so we'll start with Kanun. So the basis of all the basis of all law in Iran is Sharia, right? And that is religious law that is based on the teachings of the Quran and teachings in the Hadith. Remember, the Hadith is a collection of sayings and deeds and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, not written by him or written during his lifetime, but written afterwards by those close to him. And so some hadith are considered to be more legitimate than others, depending on sort of the line of attribution that comes through them. But Sharia is drawn from both of those texts, okay? Now, any law, excuse me, I'm thirsty here. There we go. Any law that is not directly drawn from the Quran or from the Hadith is called Quran. Q-A Q-A-N-U-N, Kanun. So any law that is not inherently religious is Kanun. But all Kanun must be in accordance with Sharia in Iran. So if you write a law about the tax code in the Majlis, in the legislature, that is Kanun, because like if you're dealing with stuff like how much money you can shelter overseas or something like that, or rates of taxation, like that's not in the Hadith. That is something else. So these laws are called Kanun, but they must be read and approved to be within Sharia constraints. So there can be nothing in the Quran or Hadith that contradicts or limits what is being said in the Quran. So hopefully that explains it. I know it's a lot of terminology that we're not really familiar with in the West, but it's important stuff. The next thing is the Bajli resistance force. Okay, so here's the deal. After the revolution of 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was shortly to become the supreme leader, orders the creation of a new military force called the Revolutionary Guard. Now, the traditional military still existed, and the reason they needed a secondary group was because, number one, the military traditionally had been very loyal to the Shah. And in fact, a lot of the high-ranking officers, after the Shah had to leave Iran, after he fled, a lot of the military officers fled too, because it was too dangerous for them to stay in Iran. So what that meant was that immediately following the revolution, the military was at very limited strength, and people within the new revolutionary government were extremely concerned about it. They were deeply critical of it. They were very suspicious. They thought that there was still a lot of sort of pro-Shah activists within the military structure. There probably were. So they wanted to create a separate military organization called the Revolutionary Guard. And the Revolutionary Guard had a specific mission to it. So the traditional military of Iran, which still exists, its job is to defend Iran's borders. That is, to defend the state, the physical space of the state. So if the United States, for whatever reason, invaded into Iran today, they would fight the traditional military. They would also probably fight the Revolutionary Guard, but that's a separate matter. No. The traditional military of Iran is tasked with this job of like physically defending territory. But the Revolutionary Guard was created with the goal of defending the ideas of the revolution. Okay, so the Revolutionary Guard is not tied to the state. It is tied to the regime, and that right there is maybe the most important difference between the two of them. Now, the Revolutionary Guard also has, as part of it, a militia subset, and this militia subset is known as the Bajli, and the Bajli is a group of volunteer militias. So it's voluntary and it's civilian based, and they essentially are, their morality police is what they are. They have the right to essentially arrest and detain people on the basis of failure to adhere to revolutionary standards. And that would include things like proper hijab for women. So if a woman is accused of being in bad hijab, which you'll remember means that either her head isn't covered or that you can see more of her than her face and her hands, that's bad hijab. So if she is in bad hijab, she could be arrested by the Bajli. So essentially they're like a security force. They are authorized by the Revolutionary Guard, and they can be often used to put down protests, all sorts of stuff. They're kind of rough people. Not my favorite part of Iran right there. Let's see here. And then the last thing that Leanne wanted to know about was the faqih. Okay. So the idea of a faqih, it's F-A-Q-I-H, yeah. Faqih is a jurist, an Islamic jurist, someone who studies religious law, whose job it is to guide the people to correct behavior. So in that, essentially, there is a legal principle in Iran. The whole basis of government is based on the idea of the guidance of Islamic jurists, that this is what allows the supreme leader to hold his position, because he is a faqih. He is providing religious guidance to the people to make sure that the government doesn't become corrupt, or stray from correct religious thought. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And let me see what other. Good. We've got lots of questions going on. This is good. I like that. Okay, so let's see here. Claire has a question. Claire wants to know, could I tell you what dissidents are? Dissidents, just as a definitional term there, a dissident is someone who goes against something. In this case, we're talking about political dissidents. So a political dissident would be someone who goes against the current government structure or current regime in some sort of way. So we could talk about political dissidents in Russia. We could talk about political dissidents in China. We could definitely talk about political dissidents in Iran. Now, it's kind of dangerous to be a political dissident in any of those places. So frequently, political dissidents operate outside of the country. And in Iran, frequently, that's what people do. It's very, very dangerous to organize within, because you can be arrested and imprisoned. And yeah, it's not real great. So frequently, that means that people who object to the way that the regime is functioning frequently operate outside of it. They'll go to Pakistan, they'll go to Russia, they'll go to the UK, they'll sometimes come to the United States, depending on their political sort of goals, and they'll operate out of there. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Let's see here. Leanne also wanted to know, can I discuss the role of student protests in Iran and other case studies? Are there events that are similar? Okay. All right, so there are a number of student protests we can talk about in a lot of our case studies. The big ones that you should immediately think of would be obviously China. And I think you should also think of Mexico's Tlatelolco massacre. Okay. And in both of those, and in 2009 in Iran, although that one's not simply students, it starts that way, but it doesn't end that way. Students frequently are involved in protest, in part because of the age of the individuals involved. Young people tend to be more willing to engage in radical political dialogue. Part of that is because of the fact that younger people don't usually have the sort of social constraints that older people do. And I don't mean that in terms of like, there's peer pressure or something. What I mean is that younger people frequently don't have children yet. And having children changes people's political behavior in a lot of ways. What seems like an okay risk to take when you are 19 and single and don't have a family of your own is somehow not okay when you are 35 and have 2 children. Then things change. So younger people are frequently involved in protests because of their youth. And also because of their access to new ideas, particularly at university and things like that. So younger people are frequently involved in these protests. Additionally, they also have the time to do so frequently, sometimes by design and desire, and sometimes by unemployment. Young unemployed people have a lot of time to be angry about it, and that can make them a powerful force. So the 2009 protests and all the protests we talked about with regards to Iran going back to 1997 have featured young people in a very, very big way. But I think maybe the big examples that you're thinking about with regards to student protests would be 1989 in China, the democracy protest movement, and maybe 1968 in Mexico, which is also a democracy protest movement. And the protest in 2009 in Iran, well, not exclusively involving students, was also in favor of increased democratic liberalization. And I think that those are commonalities that you can see. And what you can see in all three cases is the use of state force to continue the power structure that currently exists. You can see that Mexico cracked down on their protesters, China cracked down on theirs, and the state of Iran did as well. So this is a common thing that we frequently see in non-liberal democratic systems, the use of state force and violence. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let's see. Leanne also wants to know what are some major protests of Iran that you should know, and can I explain the economy as means? All right. So major protests that you should know in Iran. I'm sorry, I've got something in my eye and it's really driving me nuts here. Protests in Iran that you should know. Ones prior to 2007 are good examples of the state's limited use of force. But after 2007, you can see the results of Ahmadinejad's regime and his reluctance to allow for basically any public dialogue through protest. And you can see this through the use of state forces in crackdowns in 2007. The first big one was a protest over striking bus drivers, like not hitting bus drivers, but bus drivers on strike, and the government cracking down on protesters. The second was a protest held the same year, 2007, when people took to the street in recognition of International Women's Day, and the government cracked down in force, arresting several hundred people over the course of the day. Then there's the big one, the 2009 protest, which I already talked a little bit about. Now, with regards to the idea of economy as means, that's actually a phrase from your O'Neill reading. If you read the portion on political economy, it's important to realize that the revolutionary government of Iran after 1979 is not communist, even though they do nationalize the oil industry, even though they do redistribute a lot of wealth. They are definitely not communists. They don't like communists. Part of the reason why they don't like communists is because communists, like hardcore communists, embrace the idea of atheism, and this is a theocratic state, and they certainly would not like that. But regardless, essentially what the Islamic government of Iran does is they look at economic decisions as being an out a means by which they can achieve their revolutionary goals. They think about it in terms of how can the economy of Iran be used in such a way to further the goals of the revolution. So the accumulation of wealth in and of itself is not the goal of the Iranian economic system. That is a byproduct of what it's trying to do. What it tries to do instead is to live in accordance with the revolutionary and Islamic goals of the constitution. And that includes things like the creation of bunyads for the redistribution of wealth and all sorts of other stuff. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay. Leanne also wants to know, can I define West-struckness and West-toxification? And she wants to know, is this relatively new or has it been present for a while? Okay, so this is again from your O'Neill reading. It's actually on the same page, same paragraph as the economy as means bit. So if you don't recognize that, you need to go back and reread the text. Hang on a second. And basically, what West-struckness or West-toxification is the phrase used by the Islamic government that indicates sort of an over-reliance on westernization and secularization. That this emphasis on sort of like wealth as accumulation is something like a toxicity from the West, and that the government of Iran's economic policy should seek to move away from that. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And then Andrew wants to know, will the exam ask about the relationship between Iran and, he says Rusi, but I believe he means Russia. If so, what should we know about those two lovebirds? That is a deeply uncomfortable romantic relationship right there, I gotta tell you. So they are similar in their disdain for the West in some ways. Russia's disdain for the West comes out a lot of the fact that it feels like it has been marginalized by the West and ignored by the West, whereas Iran's disdain for the West comes from a feeling of that the West is inherently corrupt and needs to be moved away from. And in a way, you can see that as well in Russia, that idea of sort of traditional conservative religious values. But I would say that that has less to do with like Putin's policies towards the West than the supreme leaders. I would definitely make a point of noting that reluctance to engage with the West. For Russia, however, they're looking to create a pivot where Russia becomes the new economic power in the region, whereas Iran isn't really trying to do that. Iran is trying to go its own way because it's not really seeing economics as the be-all, end-all. Its primary goal is the consolidation of the religious regime. Like, that's their real goal. And they definitely will ask you to compare between Iran and Russia because there are plenty of comparisons to be made. Let's see here. Any other questions? Because at this point, I have now got through all of yours. There are 6 of you still watching. So what do you got? So can I expect like nothing but A's on this exam? I'd be super excited about that, guys. Maybe? What is Ahmadinejad again? Okay, Claire. First of all, Claire, it's not a what, it's a who. Ahmadinejad, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was the president of Iran before this current president. Current president is Hassan Rouhani. The previous president between 2005 and 2013 was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Very hardcore conservative, really, really aggressive in his anti-Western rhetoric. Especially, he did not like the U.S. I mean, all Iranian leaders don't like the U.S., but like he especially really super hated it. And yeah, so basically the last 3 presidents have gone from Khatami, who was relatively liberal for a very conservative president. That sounds super weird. But in comparison to other presidents in Iran, he was pretty liberal, pretty in favor of like civil liberties and things like that. And then Ahmadinejad cracks down on civil liberties, and then Rouhani is sort of slowly opening things up again. But the election's coming up in 11 days, so we'll see how that goes. What else we got? All right, Andrew. Andrew wants to know, what is the green movement again? Opposite of the white revolution? No. Okay, the white revolution was during the Shah, okay? It's during the Shah's regime. So the white revolution was the movement to secularize Western Europe, secularize Iran. So it made wearing a full beard in public illegal for men. It did not require women to be veiled in public. It gave women the right to vote in 1963. It pushed for increased infrastructure development, increased industrialization. Infrastructure development, by the way, inside the cities, not so much out in the countryside. That was kind of left alone. But there was this emphasis on creating Iran into a modern Western nation. So a lot of Western movies being shown in movie theaters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the white revolution. And it set a lot of Iranians' teeth on edge because, frankly, it was done so quickly and so heavily from the top down, and so authoritarian, in such an authoritarian sort of manner, that it didn't really take into consideration the wishes and wants of common Iranian people. Like Iran was a traditional conservative society, and like this was real fast change without any sort of input or consideration of like the general population of Iran. So it didn't work very well. I mean, did it achieve its goals? Yeah, sure. Like women got the right to vote, men couldn't wear beards in public, but like, did it actually consider what the everyday Iranian citizen wanted? No, it did not. And that's a big problem. The Green Movement was in 2009, and it was a series of protests that were held in opposition to the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. There was widespread accusations that the voting was fraudulent, that Mousavi should have won instead. So there were widespread protests, and there was a real fear amongst the very conservative members of the Iranian government that they could see a revolution. For a period of time, it looked like it was going to go that way until it kind of was forced to stop as a result of security forces intervening. Mm-hmm. Okay, is the Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting just their form of news? Is it TV related? Yeah, Claire, it is. The Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting Corporation, it does TV, radio, news. Basically, most television stations, most radio stations, most newspapers in Iran are state run. There are a few independent media sources, particularly magazines and newspapers, but they tend to be pretty scholarly. They're not really going to take a stance with regards to politics. They'll say, you know, this law just passed the Majlis, but they won't really make commentary on it, because if they do, it's very easy for them to get their publishing license revoked. So the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting is sort of like the state-run government, the state-run media companies. Okay, let's see here. I've got something from Selena. Selena wants to know, can I explain the differences in power between political institutions, the Expediency Council, the Guardian Council, etc.? I've actually already done that kind of early in the video. So if you like back it up, Selena, and go to maybe like 5 or 7 minutes into the video, I do talk a fair bit about what the Guardian Council does, what the Expedience Council does. The only ones that I didn't really get to would be the Majlis. Majlis is a legislative body under the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it predates the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's been around since before the Shahs. It was established under the Qajars, and it is a legislative body based on a parliamentary system. So you elect people based on parties, but that doesn't really matter in Iran, right? Because why? Because parties don't matter in Iran, because essentially, yeah, you're based on individuals. So essentially it's a parliamentary system, but it doesn't function like one in comparison to the UK. They have the power of the purse, meaning that they're the ones who generate the budget and pass it and all of that sort of stuff. They also have the ability to they can approve and disapprove cabinet appointments by the president. They can approve ministry appointments. They can approve his vice presidential selections. All of those sort of things have to be approved through the Majlis. Yeah, so they actually do have a fair bit of power. The problem is that their legislative ability is curtailed by the Expediency Council and the Guardian Council. Let's see here. I think we're good. Anything else? What you got for me? All right, Claire, yay! Okay, what do I think would be the top 3 most important things for you to know for the test? I would be able to trace out essentially the powers of each of the various bodies within the government. Draw a flowchart. Draw a flowchart and show where the power goes. Be able to tell me what the supreme leader can do, what the supreme leader can't do. Hint, Not much. The president, know what the powers of the presidency are and what they aren't. Then I would make sure that you can do the same with each of the case studies we have gone through for this class. This is not just good review for the AP exam coming up, but it's good review for the test coming up. This test is going to be heavily comparative, because this is the last of our case studies and we've gone through everything now. And so I can give you questions that compare everything because we've got everything now. Okay. So I would make sure that you can compare government structure for everything. I would definitely know how people are elected, what their electoral system looks like in Iran versus other case studies we've talked about. I would definitely be able to talk about social cleavages. Yeah. Yeah, I'd really focus on electoral systems, legislative systems, and be able to compare things. I would definitely do that. Seeing as I've already given the test a couple of times here because we have people who will be absent tomorrow, like, trust me on this. That's what you should be studying, okay? Um, yeah, if you, frankly, Claire, if you can compare things well with other countries, you're doing okay. All right. Anything else, guys? I'd planned on this being 2 hours, but if you're done in one, then you're super efficient and you know what you're talking about, right? No, that's it. You all done? Well, hopefully you've turned on the television today and you paid attention to what's going on internationally in terms of the news, and you saw that Le Pen lost the presidency in France, so that's exciting. How is Iran related to mercantilism? Okay, well, mercantilism is frequently associated with parastatal industries, right? So if you remember, mercantilism is kind of the idea, like traditionally, that the more money the state has, the more powerful the state is, right? That goes all the way back to like the imperialism of the UK and everything. But in this case, we can talk about it. So, like, the state generates a huge amount of money through its oil industry, right? And that money is then funneled in through things called bunyads. And bunyads are these essentially parastatals. And they are organizations in Iran. They're essentially charitable, theoretically, excuse me, charitable organizations, and their job is to redistribute funds to the Iranian people. And it's supposed to be sort of like a manifestation of the five pillars, the one dealing with almsgiving. And so the whole idea here is that, like, you've got the Martyrs Foundation and the Foundation for the Oppressed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the government gives money to these charitable organizations, and these charitable organizations then distribute it to the people. And so to a certain degree, what happens is that all of these nationalized industries that Iran has, and they have lots of nationalized industry, not just oil, but also things like, trying to think, sugar production, that sort of stuff. The money from those goes to various organizations, like the Martyrs Foundations or like the Revolutionary Guard. And so you have these really big industries that directly benefit the government through these organizations. So that's how it's kind of related to mercantilism. Let's see here. Nothing else coming in via Twitter. Anything else? Give you a couple of more minutes, see if you can come up with questions. All right. The importance of nuclear power in Iran. Okay. Well, there's a whole section in the end of your textbook chapter on this, so make sure you've read it carefully. But nuclear power in Iran is a really contentious issue. So first and foremost, what you have to understand is that Iran Iran doesn't have like tepid relationships with countries. Iran has people who it like vehemently supports, and then people it wants to like wipe off the face of the earth. Like the Iranian state under the guardianship of the supreme leader has called for the eradication of the state of Israel, which is obviously deeply problematic for a number of reasons. Now, you may like what Israel does on a policy level, you may not like what Israel does on a policy level, but calling for a state's eradication is a pretty big deal. So the idea of Iran having nuclear power and the potential to make nuclear weapons is a very contentious one because of that. Now, Iran's use of nuclear power, you can use nuclear power for entirely legitimate reasons, right? You can have nuclear power plants and use it to fund electricity, et cetera, throughout your country. And Iran makes the argument that that is what it intends to do with its creation of various centrifuges, et cetera, for the refinement of uranium ore. Now, the thing is that Iran does have a point in that it can't rely on stuff like hydroelectric power, because if you look at the topography of Iran and you look at its geography, it just doesn't have hydroelectric power to use. Its other alternatives would be then, say, coal-fired power plants, which it does use. That's actually part of the reason why they had a coal mine collapse last Wednesday, if you've been paying attention to the news, which is devastatingly horrible stuff. But coal power plants obviously produce a heck of a lot of CO2 emissions and all sorts of things. And Iran has problems with pollution already. So its argument is that by shifting to nuclear power plants, it can reduce its ultimate carbon footprint, that it can reuse its nuclear material over and over again in the same manner that France does once it gets its technology to that level, and it'll be relatively safe and relatively cheap for the Iranian people to get electricity that way. That's the idea. However, it requires them to be able to refine uranium. And once you refine uranium to a certain stage, it is possible to make nuclear weapons. And they have definitely been interested in making nuclear weapons for offensive capabilities. So there have been years and years and years of debate over this throughout the UN and the United States and all sorts of stuff. You've had the Atomic Energy Agency, the International Atomic Agency, Energy Agency, wow, brain gone, a debate over this for years in the UN, and try to send in inspectors to make sure that Iran is only refining uranium for the use in nuclear power plants and not going farther to use it in nuclear weapons. There's like a technical difference as to how far you refine it in order to use it for either one of those things. You do something with it, and clearly you can't be using it for nuclear power plants, etc. So what has happened is the Obama administration over the past several years had been working out a negotiation to try and get Iran to agree to allow inspectors in to make sure that they are not using their material for the creation of nuclear weapons. And if they meet all of these requirements, and they're pretty dang stringent requirements, and can prove that they are not building things that will be used for nuclear weapons, then eventually some of the economic sanctions relating to Iran's use of nuclear or attempt to develop nuclear weapons lifted. That, by the way, is unrelated to sanctions that are already passed with regards to Iranian human rights violations. So it wouldn't resolve all of their sanctions problems. But Iran, because of its economic straits right now, the fact that it's got like a 13% unemployment rate, especially among its young male population, this was something that Rouhani was really pushing for, because they want he wants an increase in economic liberalization in Iran. And so they've signed on to this nuclear deal. Now, there are a lot of hardline people within the United States who dislike this deal, who think that it's going to be easy for Iran to manipulate it. There are a lot of skeptics globally as to whether or not this is a good decision. Israel, as you might imagine, is not a fan of this deal. In Iran, on the other hand, people are pretty dang pleased with it because, number one, it will hopefully for them result in the lifting of various sanctions, and their economic system is pretty dang strained right now. So that's one thing. Um, Hopefully that'll help a little bit. But yeah, read that last passage in your textbook and make sure you understand it pretty well. Okay. Anything else? Got a couple coming in on Twitter. Here we go. Okay. All right. Leanne wants to know, how does the role of oil in Iran compare to the role of oil in other case studies? In Iran, oil is definitely the foundation of their economic structure. They are clearly a resource trap country. They rely really, 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 really heavily on oil. That is basically the foundation of most of their economic development. So they used to be what we would consider a rentier state, meaning that they charged rents to foreign nations to extract the oil. Now, the oil in Iran is today entirely nationalized, meaning that the country controls it, not foreign corporations. In that regard, it's very similar to Mexico, although Mexico has taken steps to privatize their oil industry again, and only about 60% of it is owned by the state. The Another example of sort of like the results of rentier statism can be seen in Nigeria. But the other thing that I would point out about all three of those countries, Iran, Nigeria, and Mexico, is how vulnerable they are to the oil markets and what that has done in each of those countries. Think about the oil crisis of the 1970s into the 1980s. The oil markets tanked in like 1978 to 1980. In each of those countries, you can see the effects of all of those things. So in Mexico, what it did was it prompted Mexico to join NAFTA, to engage in economic liberalization, to attempt to denationalize a lot of their parastatals. So they got rid of, like, they had like 1,200 parastatals. They whittled it down to like 215. They do still have Pemex, but Pemex is kind of a public-private partnership now. In Iran, on the other hand, they've sort of doubled down on the idea of nationalizing oil, that is their primary reliance, and they have a lot of market customers in the area that they work with. And in Nigeria, again, you can see their response to oil markets fluctuations by the sort of outbreak of political discontent, etc. So you can kind of see that pattern whenever you look at those three major countries. Leanne also wants to know, what is the Pahlavi Foundation? Good question. So under Mohammad Reza Shah's regime, he had something called the Pahlavi Foundation, and essentially it was an organization of his own cronies, and then he would funnel money through the Pahlavi Foundation as sort of like a charitable organization, and then that foundation would give payouts to people who did him political favors. The foundation was supposed to be independently run through his own personal fortune, but it did skim a heck of a lot of money off the top, especially coming from the oil industry. So the Pahlavi Foundation was deeply corrupt and associated with sort of the overbearing sort of cronyism of the Shah. Okay, let's see here. How we doing? Any other questions? Sorry, there's a small dog outside my window barking a whole lot. Hopefully he's not too distracting for you guys. All right, have we got any further questions, guys? No? If we don't have questions, I'm going to shut this down. I'll give you 30 more seconds to give me a question, okay? All right, lovelies. I think that's it then, okay? Good luck on your studying. I'll try to send out a practice game for you this evening if I get a chance after I do my Mother's Day thing with my family, okay? But do make sure that you work through all of those terms. Really do some comparative work, okay? Make another chart, add on to the one from last time. Make sure that you can compare and contrast the voting systems in all of those various places. Think about the role of the legislature in all of the countries we've talked about. Be able to compare and contrast like the judiciary within all of them. This will stand you in good practice for the AP exam coming up on Thursday. Now, I know some of you have your AP exam for bio tomorrow, as well as I think there's one other exam. Good luck. Get to bed at a decent hour. Don't stay up until 2. That doesn't help anyone, okay? All right? And I will see you tomorrow, okay? See you.